All right, welcome everybody to the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you guys tonight to this episode. Thank you for taking time out of your day, your night, your evening, morning, wherever it is that you're coming uh, to the Sentinels of Liberty podcast from around the world or even in the United States. I thank you very much for sharing some of your time with me. Tonight, it's going to be kind of an interesting conversation. It's something that I've kind of had an interest in. It's something I've been learning about here and there, but it's a conversation that I think surrounds a clause that is not only misunderstood and misused, but often used as a mechanism or a tool for usurpations that occur from the federal government to the states and throughout the people. And when we get into the meat and potatoes of what this clause is, um, I think you'll start to kind of see how that evolves and how that comes about. So, what is the clause that I'm talking about that exists within the Constitution? The clause that I'm talking about is the Supremacy Clause. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the Supremacy Clause. Oftentimes, people that are, as I've often heard them called, is like federal supremacists. They, these people regard the Supremacy Clause as the one-way ticket. I can do whatever I want. In terms of speaking of the federal government, being able to get away with whatever it is that they want, whether it's laws, legislation, etc. And I think that this is a really not only a disingenuous interpretation, but it's also one of these interpretations that really lends itself to more government, tyranny, usurpation, and ultimately abuses that occur against the many states and of the people. So, what is the Supremacy Clause in particular? Well, I'll read it to you from my handy dandy pocket constitution, which in my personal opinion, I think most Americans, if not all Americans, should at least have one of these. So that way you kind of have an understanding of how the country works. So, where first off, where can we even find the Supremacy Clause? Well, we can find the Supremacy Clause in Article 6, okay? Almost right at the top of Article 6. And the Supremacy Clause goes a little something like this. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Now, one of the areas that I really, really want to emphasize is there's a portion in there, and I'll kind of go over it one more time. There's a portion in there that says in pursuance thereof. Okay, so if we go back, the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. This is very important. The wording back in that particular time had very, very heavy legal meaning. And today, those words still don't have any less legal meaning than they did way back then. And this was very important because they understood that wording was very, very crucial to the way of how they wanted to frame things. Now, they didn't say might be or possibly could be or anything like that. They wanted to use strong words in pursuance thereof, which means when we get down to the crux of the matter, the Supremacy Clause, federal laws that are created, when it's passed within the limits of the delegated powers of the Constitution, are become supreme. However, in the end, when they are not, and they are not in pursuance thereof, then they are not supreme. As a matter of fact, they're not only not supreme, but they're void, null and void over all. Which means they have no force, they have no power, they don't even, they have no ability to do anything at all, or at least that's the way that it's supposed to be. Okay, now what you get instead of the fundamental understanding of how this works is you get more of a skewed perception and a picture of what the Supremacy Clause is. A lot of people will avoid the in pursuance thereof, and they'll kind of do this, loosely stated version of the Supremacy Clause, typically to try and justify why the federal government is supreme in all cases. In all cases, not in all cases that are pursuant thereof to the Constitution, but in all cases, all the time, everywhere, and it doesn't matter. Now, this presents a very precarious situation because what you end up getting is you get this bad interpretation, or you get this bad reading, or this bad understanding, or even a willful misunderstanding of the Supremacy Clause in order to try and excuse actions that would be considered null and void. And what does this lead to? Well, it leads to a usurpation, not only a usurpation of the states, but a usurpation of the individuals ourselves. So there is something that I kind of want to utilize as a quote that I thought was kind of interesting. And of course, you can find very, very similar sentiments from people like Jefferson, from Hamilton, and Madison. But this is just one that I really, really liked because I think it did a really good job of kind of explaining the nature of how the Supremacy Clause is supposed to be, and how the federal government is supposed to operate within this sphere. So St. George Tucker on the Supremacy Clause essentially says kind of this, if you will: a law limited to such objects as may be authorized by the Constitution would, under the construction of this clause, be the supreme law of the land. So just to kind of break that down a little bit, under the construction of this clause, so the clause adhering itself to the Constitution, a law limited to such objects, so limiting itself to the confines, to the parameters of this clause and how this clause is supposed to function, will be the supreme law of the land. But a law not limited to those objects who are not made pursuant to the Constitution would not be the supreme law of the land, but an act of usurpation and consequently void. So what we kind of get from this is there's a couple different facets that we can kind of take away here. Okay. So when we look at the Supremacy Clause, what is the big thing? In pursuance thereof. So it has to be pursuant to the Constitution. It's not lending itself to whatever it is that they want to do. All willy-nilly, just passing something because they want to pass it. It's not just, the will of what the federal government wants to do, and being able to kind of force this stuff on the states and of the people. There are very strict confines as to how this is supposed to go. So when you look at what St. George Tucker says, his evaluation of the Supremacy Clause, and then further driving home that point, it's limited to such objects. These objects also include the delegated authorities, and there's very, very few delegated authorities that are reserved to the federal government. Okay, now it's one of those things to where when you look at these delegated powers and their authorities, it really kind of comes down to how it is you evaluate them and their number. Some people, might take and condense some of these things, and you might get around 17 or 18, but depending on how you count, it could be anywhere from about 30 to 35 or something to that particular degree. But it really depends on how it is that you're counting and how it is that you're evaluating these delegated powers. So with that being said, like I said, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton have very, very similar views as it pertains to this. So when you go back and you read, especially into the Federalist, Anti-Federalist arguments, you will start to begin to see how they shaped their views on the Supremacy Clause and essentially their arguments surrounding the Supremacy Clause. So the Supremacy Clause, in kind of like bringing this back around, is it does essentially say, like they're all, well, let me go back and read this here. The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. Okay. So the Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be made in pursuance thereof. So they have to be pursuant in order for them to be considered not only legitimate, but a void or not void and of force. So that is an important thing that we have to understand about the Supremacy Clause. It's one of those clauses that you tend to see when the federal government decides that it wants to pass something, but it's not. It has no adherence to the Constitution. But then you have people that will utilize this clause, and they'll say, "Well, but." The federal government is supreme in all the laws that they make, and they have the ability to do this, et cetera, et cetera. I think one of the issues that we also see when it comes to the Supremacy Clause is also in how it is taught in various universities. Oftentimes, if you look at various law universities, they have a tendency maybe to not explain it or to define it in the proper constitutional sense that it's meant to be. I remember I had watched an episode, and I have no problem saying this. I had watched an episode from the 10th Amendment Center who was kind of explaining this a little bit at length, and I would highly recommend that you go and check them out because they have a great library pertaining to not only the Supremacy Clause, but to the General Welfare Clause and many others. But Michael Bolden had essentially stated, through his observations that, places like Cornell University, well, they kind of, they're kind of a little bit better. They're not great. And oftentimes what you'll start to see in the educational spectrum is they tend to leave out things like in pursuance thereof. They kind of beat around the bush, and they try and formulate and fabricate these exceptions. And there is no exception is basically the crux of this argument, right? There is no exception. It is either adherent and pursuant, or it is null and void. So when we evaluate laws here in the United States, especially laws that come from the federal government, we have to really examine these and see, do they pass the litmus test? One, are they constitutional? Are they pursuant? Do they make sense? Do they fall within the parameters and the restrictions within the Constitution? If they do not, and if they do not meet the qualifications, even the qualifier or the qualifying markers, if you will, of even the Supremacy Clause, then they have no force. They are void. So it becomes one of those things to where when we look at the federal government and we look at the way that they pass laws, it does actually become very self-explanatory and easy to be able to be like, no, like nobody has to follow this. The states are not beholden to follow it. The people are not beholden to follow it because it does not meet the criteria. And therein lies a whole other conversation, which is the 10th Amendment conversation, which is, well, if they're not required to follow it along with the people because they're null and void, then how do we go about doing that? And that's a conversation that I would like to have down the road, but there is a basis in an argument for not following an unconstitutional law because it has no force. There's no reasonable way that they can constitutionally enforce this. And then by way, this gives to unconstitutionality, usurpations, and then it just stems from there. So the Supremacy Clause in its nature it's not overly complicated. it seems overly complicated, perhaps to some people, or maybe they just don't want to read it in its entirety because it doesn't necessarily lend to what it is that they're trying to do, which, in my opinion, is to consolidate more power, to become more centralized, and to have a lot more control. But in the end of the day, when we look at how it's supposed to be utilized and how it's supposed to be employed, we can see that, yes, there is some form of supremacy as it comes from the federal government, but, and that's a big but, as we see, as long as it is pursuant thereof. So I find this a very, I find the Supremacy Clause to be really, really interesting, mostly because I feel like it's one of those things where I've seen a lot of people debate over it, but I think it also takes part in a larger argument as it pertains to the 10th Amendment. Now, it's not the only clause for sure that I think we can get into that conversation of pertaining to the 10th Amendment, but it is certainly, I think, one of the most abused and one of the most augmented ones as it pertains to being able to just pass laws and legislation all willy-nilly in order to kind of have this growing monster state in this federal supremacist mindset, which is not, is very contrarian to how we're founded as a country, how we're intended to be as a nation, and the way that we are structured. And it also sets a precedent of, when you look at the servants and then you look at, the people that put these public servants in their offices, you look at the people and then the representatives, it creates a power schism also, where when you have the violation of the Supremacy Clause, when you have the violation of the few delegated powers and authorities that the federal government can pursue, you create this situation to where now you're having this this inverse, if you will, of power. So the people are now no longer at the helm and the most powerful aspect of our country. It is now the representatives. You now have the servants, the public servants, that are no longer they're no longer serving us. They're now the ones that are telling us what to do. And this is a very, very dangerous and perilous vacuum that we tend to get stuck in quite a bit. And now with contemporary education, it's only, I feel, getting to a point to where it ramps up a little bit more and more and more every single year that goes by. So it's very important to understand what the mechanisms of the federal government are, the delegated authorities of the federal government are. And I would highly encourage that if you're not super familiar with it, there is I will post it down in the description below. But the National Center for Constitutional Studies has these pocket constitutions. I believe they're still free. If last time I had gotten mine, but you should be able to go on and request these. If they're not, I don't think they're of very much cost whatsoever. But if you take a pocket constitution, you thumb through and you look at the different in varied authorities that do exist there, you'll get a better idea of what it is that they realistically can and cannot do. And if they start doing things that tend to, blur that line and violate what their delegated authorities are, well, if we do that check and we become that balance of, how our government is meant to fundamentally run, and we utilize the Supremacy Clause, we can now start to find the answers and be like, well, this clearly violates the Supremacy Clause. It violates the nature of the Constitution itself, and therefore these acts are null and void. And what you're doing in conjunction with that is you're preserving the the power structure that exists as it pertains to our government in relation to the people. The people are vested with the ultimate amount of power. Then you have the states. Then you have the states that create the Constitution, and then the Constitution creates the federal government. So this is essentially how that power structure goes. The federal government has the fewest and most defined powers of every other facet of our government. And this is a very, very important thing to fundamentally understand in order to mitigate the amount of federal intrusion, usurpation, and ultimately this growing, seemingly authoritarian monster state that we're having every single day. So in the grand scheme of things, the Supremacy Clause, one, is very important to understand. Why? Because it allows you to get an idea of what is and isn't not only applicable, but constitutional. And if it is not meeting those criteria, it is null and void. If it does not meet these criteria and it is null and void, it is therefore not required to have to follow these things. In addition, the understanding of the Supremacy Clause also helps you understand what it is that this metric of power really is. When the representatives put themselves above the people, when the people are the ones that delegated, which means we provided them the ability to go forth and do this, when they put themselves above us and you have that schism and that power structure start to turn and to manipulate, that is when you start to get issues and it cannot stand. So there's a few basic things that are outlined here, and I think it's very important that we understand how all of these things come together, and more importantly, for us to be involved and to educate ourselves, because Lord knows that the contemporary education system today is not going to be conducive of helping you keep them in line, keep the government in line. So I would highly, highly encourage to have you guys go check out people like Chris Ann Hall. Look at the 10th Amendment Center. They have vast libraries also that you can use as reference material in order to further your education. You could go to the National Center. Let's see here. It was the National Center for Constitutional Studies. And there's so many other wonderful resources out there that you can utilize in order to expand your knowledge on different things. And also, I think one of the aspects that's not talked about enough is get to understand what your state constitutions are, understand what the parameters of power are within your own state. So therefore, you can not only fight back against a growing monster state, but you have the ability to help kind of take back control of your own states and really put forth a bolstered bulwark against federal tyranny, but also tyranny in general. So we have to be very, very cognizant of the areas that we live in, the states that we live in order to have any chance of becoming not only more constitutional, but more liberty-oriented as a country. So I just want to say hello to Gene and to Ground Fog. I really appreciate you stopping in this evening. Thank you for taking a few minutes out of your day to come and check out what we got going on here. It's probably going to be a little bit shorter of a video tonight. I do have some links in the description below. I will probably be adding some links also that you guys might be able to go back and reference if you so choose. So this is going to be, I'm going to kind of wrap this up a little bit. I'm not going to drag this out too much. Otherwise, it starts to get a little long in the tooth. But in the end of the day, the Supremacy Clause is a very, very important clause to understand, especially if you live in the United States. You have a really good fundamental understanding of essentially part of the structure that we have in this country. So in addition to that, there was something else that I was going to try and remember, and I simply can't remember it, and I hate it when that happens. So Well, that's what I was going to say. So if we also look at the when we look at the Supremacy Clause, okay, and then we go back and we contrast that with something, to the essence of the declaratory acts and how Parliament conducted themselves in Great Britain. One of the things that I think we can take away too is the reason our supremacy clause is so important is it really binds our federal government as to what they can do, what they're supposed to be doing, and the way that they are able to create and put forth laws and legislation and all of these different things. They don't have the ability to just overwhelmingly, in one fell swoop, be able to do these things with no consequence. And as a result, if they do, they become null and void. Whereas when you look back in the times of our founders, the Declaratory Act in particular really vested the power into the British government at the time to where they could basically, go through without a single issue and, declare and create laws with really little to no ramifications whatsoever. And that's not to say that perhaps there wasn't protest or anything of that nature, but in the end of the day, largely they were relatively uncontested. So the Supremacy Clause is, in essence, a sort of bulwark, but it also states that as long as there are laws that are made in pursuance thereof, that they do have the full weight and force. When they are not, then they have no weight and force, they are null and void, and they are of no effect. So, in that, I know this was a little bit shorter than usual, but I feel like if I'm able to summarize some of these things up a little bit, it makes it a little bit more digestible in terms of the understanding of things like the Supremacy Clause and perhaps down the road the General Welfare Clause. And to some of my fellow constitutional scholars and my very liberty-oriented friends, if there is something that I missed that perhaps I should have put in there, please feel free to comment down below. Please add to the discussion. Please feel free to, kind of supplement what it is that the conversation was about tonight. I would absolutely love to hear from you and to see what it is that you guys also have to contribute, because in the end of the day, I'm still learning. I'm still trying to get a really good grasp on some of these essential concepts and to be able to provide some of the best information that I possibly can to you. Like I said, if you haven't yet already, check out the 10th Amendment Center and also check out Chris Ann Hall. And there are a number of other wonderful organizations that exist. And I would also highly recommend checking out the Libertarian Institute. And if you want to get involved at the state level and get involved with an organization that I personally feel does a really good job of helping push forward the realm of liberty, check out the American Liberty Caucus, see what they're all about. I'm part of it. I absolutely think very highly of those people that all are a part of it there in the American Liberty Caucus. And it gives you an opportunity to kind of do your part, to get involved, to meet people in your area, to make the biggest difference at a local and state level. I have the link in the description below, as well as a few other links that kind of expand further upon the conversation of the Supremacy Clause, maybe a little bit more in depth, and provide a little bit more nuance than maybe I have even tonight. So with that being said, I'm going to kind of wrap it up here. I really, really appreciate everybody coming by. This was a little bit of a shorter one, and I'm hoping that next weekend, the conversation that we're going to have, which will probably be a little bit longer, captures your interest, and you stick around, you come in for the comments, and you like what you hear. So I believe, let's see here, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before I leave here. So next week is the 19th. I should be having Tom Edlin back. If you remember him, he was the economist and fellow from the Libertarian Institute that I had regarding the economy discussion that we had. I'm excited to have him back. And I really, really look forward to the discussion that we're going to have regarding fascism. So I hope that you all will join me next Saturday on the 19th for that discussion. I greatly appreciate you taking time out of your day, and I hope to see you down the road. So thank you, and we'll see you soon. God bless.